Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Wherever you are around the world or wherever you're watching this, welcome back to episode 4 of the Future of War. So, we've already talked about the strategic, operational, tactical levels of war and the ladder that escalates between them. We've already also talked about domains. You should be able to understand and articulate what those are. From here, we have the perfect foundation for understanding a little bit more about America's geopolitical rivals, get to know them a little bit more intimately. And so, today's lesson objectives are to understand the core tenets of Russian military doctrine. From there, we will understand the situation of Russia in Ukraine. And then from there, we'll be able to kind of discuss and have more in-depth and complex discussions about the way Russia goes about warfare. So let's talk about Russia at the strategic level. So as a reminder, every country's military is subordinate to its political goals. Now, the military, just like any other tool that a country can use when in terms of foreign affairs, such as diplomacy, economic sanctions, the military is just a tool to achieve that. Ideally, it's a last-ditch effort, but it's a tool nonetheless. So at the strategic level, to understand Russia's military, we have to understand that Russia wants to rise to the former glory of the Soviet Union. Russia used to be a very, very more powerful country. They used to be part of something called the Soviet Union. It was a huge, huge, huge country with a lot of influence, a lot of power, and it was this huge collection of these Soviet socialist republics. And so much so that the Russian establishment, especially President Vladimir Putin, kind of wants to go back to the glory days. Vladimir Putin, the current president of Russia, even wrote in an article that the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century, according to him, was the fall of the Soviet Union. And so that kind of gives you a view into the mindset of the Soviet Union. And on top of that, too, they just don't accept the US-led world order. And they would rather prefer a multipolar world where US power, US hegemony is checked by Russia and other like-minded countries. So one of the greatest, if not the greatest, obstacle at stopping Russia to achieving all of these things is the fact that here's Russia, here's all the countries that it wants to kind of regain influence over, and here's NATO, the military alliance, the strongest military alliance in human history, aligned against them. And so Russia understands that if they just so much as poke a small country like Estonia over here, it will trigger a huge, huge, huge reprisal and potentially millions of soldiers and some of the richest countries on earth that can throw a lot of money into investment in military technology can come crashing down at them at any second. It's essentially a huge 31v1, and it's not good. So with all these limitations in mind, right, let's kind of very quickly summarize what Russia is working with. So their weakness right now is that they have a lack of military parity with Western militaries. They understand it takes a while for a country to build a competent military, and it's obviously very expensive to be able to go toe-to-toe with a lot of these Western countries that have a lot more resources available at their disposal. On top of that, too, there is a risk of escalation with NATO, especially with the Article 5 part of NATO's treaty. Article 5, as a reminder, is the stipulation in the NATO article that dictates that if you attack one NATO country, it's an attack against all NATO countries. So if you poke one country, that's a huge escalation already. And on top of that, too, Russia does not want to risk a nuclear war with the United States. It doesn't matter what country you're from, what side of the geopolitical debate you fall on, what political party you are, no one wants nuclear war. And so with that being said, let's kind of get to know Russian military doctrine, how the doctrine is built in a way that addresses all of these challenges and a lot of these concerns. So Russian military doctrine is split into generally two parts that you need to know. The first part is new generation warfare. So ideally, Russia wants to keep all of its military interventions as low-key and as risk-free and as cheap as possible. Because remember, they don't want to risk an escalation that could turn into a huge, expensive, and destructive war against NATO. So the Russians have a very heavy emphasis on cyber warfare and psychological operations, and any type of essentially gray zone action that could hurt your enemies but not trigger an all-out war. And that makes sense, right? Because cyber warfare, if you cyber attack another country, if you meddle in their elections, if you do your best to manipulate their politics to be as toxic as possible so they tear each other apart from the inside, is generally a lot less risky than an actual all-out war with that other country. So that makes sense because Russia has cyber attacked both the United States and Europe, and they've, without a doubt, tried to meddle within US electoral affairs. And it hasn't resulted in an all-out war with Russia. And so their doctrine leans heavily into this as well. They believe in this so much that actually physical military force, any type of kinetic action, is subordinate to operations in the cyber and the human domain. Essentially, what that means is that Russia will not take any kinetic military action in real life, without ensuring that their cyber and their human domain is secured. So that's the first part of Russian military doctrine. This is the ideal scenario before a war starts. But if push comes to shove and actual conflict starts with actual missiles flying around, Russia also has a plan for that as well. So ideally, to characterize this second phase and second phase of Russian military doctrine, the Russians want to ensure that the war is quick, it doesn't last long, and it ends on favorable terms for the Russians. And so if push comes to shove and NATO's Article 5, God forbid, is triggered somehow, the Russians will use as many missiles and artillery and as many type of their long-range strike platforms to destroy NATO as quickly as possible. They will target those logistical hubs, communications infrastructure, headquarters, anti-air defenses. They will essentially target all of these critical nodes that NATO will use to bring its forces to bear, to do this as quickly as possible. Then from there, Russia will then be able to have the freedom to maneuver and utilize other domains to seize military objectives. And from there, they will actually negotiate from positions of strength. And so this is a doctrine that's characterized by quickly striking your enemy, taking military objectives, and from there being able to de-escalate in order to negotiate and come out stronger than you were at the beginning of the conflict. And on top of that too, if it is necessary, nuclear weapons can be used to threaten NATO and threaten anyone else in order to de-escalate. It's kind of like this weird thing where it's like you're playing chicken with your enemy and you're hoping your enemy kind of backs down so that you can seize the advantage. Ideally, this is how Russian military doctrine should work. So let's kind of go into a case study of how Russia kind of executed its military doctrine and how it generally worked out for them. So a lot of people may think that the actual Russian invasion of Ukraine started in 2022. Actually, that's wrong. Russia actually invaded Ukraine all the way back in 2014. I doubt many of you remember, unless you're really into this type of stuff and follow the news a lot. Maybe some of you might have not heard of it, and that's totally okay too. Actually, it was probably better for Russia if not a lot of people remember this. But essentially, during this time, Ukraine is a huge country and matters a lot to Russian security. Because if Ukraine becomes a thriving democracy that is aligned with the West, that is a huge threat to Russian political stability, because then a lot of Russians who may not be living in the best living situations might flock to Ukraine. And on top of that too, the West could use Ukraine as a bargaining chip against Russia. Because you can see here in the South, Ukraine is very strategically vital because of their Crimean Peninsula. And from here, Ukrainians, right, if they align with the United States or with European countries, they can utilize the Crimean Peninsula as a way to kind of blockade Russia navally. So that's a little bit of a strategic tidbit for you. And on top of that too, the naval ports down here in the Crimean Peninsula are very vital to Russia as well. They want to use it for military or political purposes. So that's why Ukraine is important to Russia. And so back in 2014, the Ukrainian legislature voted on a bill that would kind of begin the talks with the European Union or the EU, which was like a very Western aligned country. They wanted to see if, they're flirting with the idea of potentially Ukraine could join the EU. And so this would be a huge step in the West for Ukraine, huge victory for also the West as well, but a huge defeat for Russia if it actually went through. And so luckily for Russia, the president, which is a separate branch of the Ukrainian government, right? The president of Ukraine, his name is Viktor Yanukovych. He vetoed the bill. He said, European Union? Nah, son, that ain't happening. And so Viktor Yanukovych wanted to align himself more with Russia and align Ukraine with Russia. And this caused a huge outrage. There were protests in the streets, and Viktor Yanukovych's government cracked down on those protests. A bunch of protesters died from police shooting at them, and it spiraled into a whole thing. And it was really, really bad. And it resulted in Viktor Yanukovych actually fleeing the country because of how unpopular his policies were. On top of that, too, there was another election, and another president was elected, Volodymyr Zelensky. And so Ukraine was going through this huge political turmoil, and Russia was like, shoot, we got to act. We got to do something to ensure that we keep a thumb and keep an eye on Ukraine. And so Russia invaded these regions right here, Luhansk, Donetsk, and the Crimean Peninsula down here. And so how did this happen? How did they pull this off? Why was this invasion successful, but the one in 2022 seemed to be so bogged down? Well, let's talk about that. So Russia did a lot of very interesting, very sneaky tactics during this time. So first of all, foremost, Russia utilized a lot of blistering cyber attacks to cripple the Ukrainian government's ability to coordinate a response. On top of that, too, undercover Russian soldiers invaded Ukraine. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, Russian soldiers did eventually move into Ukraine to kind of help achieve their objectives, but the Russian government instructed that their soldiers actually take off any Russian flags on their uniforms or any type of unit insignias that could indicate that they were Russian. And they made these soldiers not talk to the press and basically told them to tell everyone that, oh, we are Ukrainian, quote unquote, self-defense forces. This gave Russia a cover, gave them plausible deniability so that they can essentially say, look, these aren't our soldiers. These are self-defense forces. These are local Ukrainians. That's totally out of our hands. Kind of sow doubt and give themselves an out when people start questioning them. On top of that, too, disinformation clouds news feeds. A lot of Russian-speaking, pro-Russia, Russian-sponsored, however you want to put it, news channels were putting out stories, fake stories. They were spreading disinformation about the actual situation in Ukraine. A very famous example was when a Russian actress was playing a role as a Ukrainian mother, and she claimed that the Ukrainian army killed her kids and dragged them around, their bodies around on tanks, like behind tanks. Really horrific story, if it were true. On top of that, too, pro-Russian Ukrainians are armed and empowered and supported by the Russians. So what do I mean by that? So let me break this down if it sounds a little bit confusing to you, but closer towards the eastern part of Ukraine, closer towards the border with Russia, there were a lot more pro-Russia Ukrainians, a lot of Ukrainians that thought that it would be better off if they were under the influence or just as a part of Russia themselves. And so a lot of these, separatists were given weapons, they were armed, they were helped out by the Russian government. And from there, Russia actually held some quote unquote free elections. And a lot of these regions, allegedly, we can't confirm this as outside sources, right? A lot of these regions actually voted to be a part of Russia. So they unofficially, not recognized by the world, became parts of Russia officially. And so these were some of the tactics that Russia used during the time. And so from here, what do we call these tactics? This type of set collection of very deceptive, very sneaky tactics utilized by Russia. And so a lot of military thinkers have kind of summarized and named these types of tactics hybrid warfare. Now, hybrid warfare, still a very controversial concept within the spheres of military thinkers. Some military thinkers out there might cringe at the fact that I'm using the term hybrid warfare. Others are chill with it, so it depends on who you fall with. But for the purpose of this class, we'll just call it hybrid warfare. So hybrid warfare is any combination of offensive action that involves manipulation of the human domain with information, disinformation, cyber warfare, and other type of deceptive tactics. The goal of hybrid warfare is to sow chaos, confuse the enemy, delay any type of retaliatory action, and achieve something called a fait accompli. Fait accompli is French for it's already been decided, or something along the lines of that. I speak Spanish, not French, so I wouldn't be able to give you the 100% accurate translation there. But a fait accompli attack basically means that you have utilized the human domain, cyber warfare, other type of deceptive tactics to give yourself cover, to shape the environment in such a way that when you actually take physical military action, that you basically have 100% or near close to it chance of success. That is where the term, it has already been decided. So a fait accompli attack means an attack that's already going to result in success for you or for the Russian government. And so this makes sense because, first of all, these tactics are deceptive in nature, and they're cheaper, they're a lot less risky because you're not actually triggering an all-out war, you're not triggering Article 5, you are not forcing an overt military response from your enemies. On top of that, too, they make sense because the Russian military doctrine basically says that all physical kinetic military action with any tanks, any airstrikes, with any actual overt invasion is subordinate to the operations in the human and cyber domain. And on top of that too, right, like I said before, hybrid warfare designed to be cheaper and less risky. And so everything worked out. It seemingly worked out in 2014 for Russia. There were some downsides as well. There's a lot of anti-Russia sentiment began to slowly kind of go up amongst the Ukrainian population during this time. However, Russia managed to basically have a foothold in the country, in Ukraine, to have some influence over Ukrainian political affairs. And they were able to basically freeze any type of political action against Russia if Ukraine wanted to join the EU, during the time at least. We're going to talk a little bit more in class about the pros and the cons of this type of warfare, and we're going to talk about a lot more case studies as well in class. But this is kind of like the type of hybrid warfare that I want everyone to kind of wrap their heads around initially. And so, if everything worked out in 2014, how come 2022 seemed to be such a huge mess for the Russians? So, the initial failure of the Russian military in the invasion of 2022. So first and foremost, right, one of the huge downfalls of any type of military when they're trying their best to become competent is corruption. A lot of Russian oligarchs and people at the highest levels of government essentially stole money when they were given money for like new systems or for repairs or for recruiting new soldiers. They would pocket a lot of the money. And so there's a famous study, a famous example of a Russian general that somehow on paper made $100,000 a year, US equivalent, $100,000 a year. And somehow he's able to afford a couple $1 million mansion. You should probably start asking some questions about how exactly he pulled that off. And on top of that, too, a lot of up and down the man structure and the levels of the Russian military. A lot of Russian military personnel were just selling off pieces of their equipment. They're selling off motors, selling off wiring. It wasn't necessarily a good condition for military effectiveness because once the war actually kicked off, a lot of the corruption showed its ugly head and the Russians were left without good equipment. On top of that, Russian military just lacks motivation and morale. Compared to the US military, well, terms and conditions may apply. There's always exceptions. But the Russian military is full of a bunch of conscripts that aren't paid very well. And on top of that, too, that military corruption means that their food, their living accommodations, a lot of the things that help keep soldiers happy weren't very good in the Russian military. And on top of that, too, the Russians just underestimated the Ukrainian will to fight. So when the Russians invaded in 2022, the Ukrainian government at the time was very unpopular with the people. And Russia thought that the human domain was in the bag for them. They were like, oh, we're going to be welcomed to the country as saviors. We're going to welcome with open arms. There's going to be parades in the street, and we're going to take the country in like 3 days. That, unfortunately, did not happen. And the Ukrainians were a lot more patriotic than they thought, and they fought tooth and nail. And to this day, as the time of recording this, the Ukrainians still have a will to fight. On top of that, too, Western weapons and support. So a bunch of other rich countries like the United States, Canada, all of its allies basically started pouring in training and pouring in weapon systems to help support Ukraine. One of the most famous examples of this is actually right here on screen, the Javelin anti-tank missile launcher. And so this is a rocket launcher, a guided rocket launcher that uses a computer to guide a rocket to its target. And this weapon is designed to basically tear apart tanks. And on top of that, too, we'll talk a little bit more about this in class. But the Russian military at this time, due to all of these factors, right, they weren't the most effective in the battlefield, and they actually did not do combined arms warfare well. They basically suffered from the same problems as the Iraqi military that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. And they did not care about the coordination between domains. They threw tanks out without support, and the Ukrainians basically ambushed these tank columns with their javelins, and it was a whole mess. Now, at the time of recording this, December 28th, 2023, the war could have potentially changed in either side's favor. So we will end this presentation here, and we'll talk a lot more about this in class. So I hope you guys are having a wonderful week so far, and I will see you all in class.